I'm Darren Miles with Darren Miles Photography, and I'm based here in beautiful, sunny Southwest Florida. And today, I wanted to talk to you about 5 things that I really hate about the Nikon Zf. Okay, so before we get into this video and before the messages start coming and the comments start coming about how this is just a hit piece on the Nikon Zf, let me be very, very, very clear. Before I even get into this quote-unquote hit piece, I love this camera. I really do. In fact, it's the first new camera that I've bought in quite a long time. I want to say it's been about 2 years. I think the last new camera that I bought was the Sony A7S Mark III, which I love. But I've always been kind of a Nikon guy, at least I have been for the last 10 years. And when I saw the Zf, I fell in love with it. I loved the way it looked. I loved the retro styling. I knew I had to have one. But like with any camera, once you've used it for a few months, that's when you start to recognize the things that are great about the camera and the things that aren't so great about the camera. I've never really been a huge fan of those videos that come out when a product is released. They've been given to some photographers, sometimes for just a few hours, and they give their first impressions review, and sometimes they're pretty good, but by and large, I'm a much bigger fan of the Philip Bloom method of doing reviews. If you don't know who Philip Bloom is, he's a great reviewer, but he's the kind of guy that will use a product for 6 months or 7 months before he does a long and very comprehensive review about what's so good about the camera and what isn't so good about the camera. Now granted, he's done mostly for video, not so much for stills, but my intent with this particular camera is to tell you about the 5 things that in the first 2 months of ownership have really driven me crazy. So if you're curious to know what that list is, stick around and here we go. Number 1 is the grip. And honestly, it's not even so much the grip, it's more kind of like the lack of a grip. Let me show you real quick. I'm going to take this small rig device off, which is pretty cool. But if you take the Nikon Zf, there's really nothing here. There's no good place for it. Yeah, the retro design is really, really cool, but one of the things that I love about the Nikon Z6, for example, and the Nikon Z5, frankly, the whole Nikon Z line of mirrorless cameras, what I love about them is even though they're all very utilitarian looking, if you look, the grip is very, well, grippy. And it makes hand-holding the camera really comfortable, even if the camera itself isn't the most aesthetic thing to look at. The Nikon Zf kind of feels like a Leica. Now, that said, when I put the small rig grip on here, this is certainly better, but it's still not great because my fingers still kind of dig in here, and I'm kind of just, it's like my fingernails dig into the body. It's just not the most comfortable thing in the world, and I find myself using this on a tripod more than anything else. But, you know, granted, we want these retro style things, we want things to look cool, and unfortunately one of the shortcomings, for me anyway, and everybody's hands are different, but for my hands, the lack of a grip in the Nikon Zf, even with the small rig grip, is still a little bit too small. I actually wish they made this thing a little bit bigger so it was actually even more grippy. But if I had to start with one thing, it's the grip and how not so comfortable the Nikon Zf feels in my hand. Number 2 is the ridiculous placement of the memory card slots. I've never been a huge fan of memory card slots placed next to the battery on the underside of the camera. I've always preferred to have them onto the side here with the side door, easy access. Now I'm sure there are engineering reasons as to why Nikon did this, maybe to preserve the retro design, but for whatever reason they put the memory cards under here. That isn't so much the bad part. The bad part is that this is actually poorly designed. Let me explain. First things first, it's backwards. The pin sides actually face the battery, which feels backwards to me. It feels like the memory label side should be on the upside, but it's actually the pins that go in like this to lock it into place. And you have to remember that because unfortunately, if you put it in label side up like this, the card will actually go into the slot and then it gets jammed there, and then getting it out is a nightmare. You might need a pair of tweezers or something because the space to get your fingers in there is really, really small. and really hard to get it out of there. So I feel like I'm going to damage the memory card slot, and I have to be very cognizant and very aware that it should be pin side out, but I still make that mistake in spite of the fact of knowing that's the case. It's very easy to put it in the wrong way. The other memory card slot is a micro SD slot. Now, as many of you know, I love cameras that have 2 memory card slots. In fact, it's a professional requirement for me, especially if you shoot weddings. I'm of the opinion that you should always have 2 memory card slots. And micro SD, though I don't think is a great choice, I'm glad they have it instead of nothing. And for me, I treat this micro SD card like it's onboard memory. I really don't have any intention of taking this thing out of here unless my SD card gets corrupted or damaged or whatever. Then I have a backup. That's really the only time I plan on using it. But again, I'm sure Nikon had their engineering reasons for doing this, but as an everyday user of this camera, when it comes to taking the memory card out of the slot and putting this card back into the slot, you just have to remember that the SD card is pin side up facing the battery. If you get it wrong, you can jam it in there, and again, it's a total nightmare to get it out of there. Number 3 is the limited number of custom function buttons. One of the things I've gotten really accustomed to with the Nikon Z6 Mark II is in the front here, there are 2 custom function buttons that I can assign and map certain functions that I like to utilize when I'm shooting. With the Z6 Mark II, I've mapped the focus mode to 1 and the punch in to 100% to the other, which makes sure that I'm nailing focus, especially if I'm utilizing a manual focus lens. Well, the downside to the ZF is the limited number of custom function buttons, and in this particular case, there's only 1 in the front here, so I'm kind of stuck with just that 1 button in the front, and I've actually mapped this to my autofocus mode that I want to select. I kind of wish I had the punch in to 100%, but I'll deal with it. But in an ideal world, I really wish it had more custom function buttons that were accessible to the front. Again, Z6 Mark II has that, and I can hear people telling me now, well, gee, Darren, why didn't you wait for the Z6 Mark III? Fair question. As I mentioned earlier, I love the styling of the ZF, and I really wanted one. So I bought it, and unfortunately, one of the shortcomings is, in fact, the lack of more than just 1 custom function button in the front of the camera. Number 4, I'm sure like a lot of people, you saw the ZF, and like me, you fell in love with this thing. You were like, oh cool, it's like an old Nikon Z from back in the day, you know, the kind that Steve McCurry had when he photographed the Afghan girl, for example. It's so cool looking, it's so hipster. It reminds me of Fuji, because I know there's Fuji people out there just saying all this really is a full-frame version of the X-T5. And all of that is probably true. But one of the cool things that Fuji has that Nikon doesn't is lenses whose style actually match the retro design of the camera. One of the unfortunate things about the Nikon Z line of lenses is that from an aesthetic standpoint, they're kind of boring. They're very utilitarian looking. They're barrels with rings and they don't have any shape. They're just boring, especially the f1.8 lenses. There's really no character or styling to them. The best way to describe it is, it's kind of like you bought this retro home and then you put this modern countertop in this panel-lined kitchen and it just looks totally like a mismatch. And that's kind of how the ZF feels with the majority of Z or the Nikon S line of lenses. Those are all great and very capable lenses, but as far as the looks go, very utilitarian and not retro styling at all. In fact, they're kind of boring and they're just a total mismatch with this camera. Yes, I can adapt some old school lenses to this to give me my aperture ring and manual focus and all that, sure. One of the things that I do like that Nikon has done when they introduced the ZF, they made a 40mm f2 that kind of had a retro design as well. I'm not saying they need to go back and retrofit all of their Z line of lenses to look the same, but maybe like a retro line that kind of goes along with the ZF. Anyway, from a stylistic standpoint, as cool and as hip and as nice as this camera is, the current line of Nikon Z lenses are a total stylistic mismatch. And lastly, number 5 is the tilty flippy screen. Now I know for a lot of people this is a bit of an opinion splitter. I kind of like the tilty flippy screen, but this one does feel a little bit flimsy to me, and it locks into place. It actually sometimes is difficult to wedge this thing open, and it's just not the best. Like I said, the quality is good. I've never really liked the quality of virtually any tilty flippy screen. Resolution's pretty good, but like the Z6, the viewfinder's view is just so much crisper and sharper and better. This screen is fine, it's just not great. Now, if you're a vlogger and you want to turn this thing around so you can compose your shot, that makes perfect sense, and I can understand why you'd find that appealing. But to me, I kind of like the old school version on the back of the Zf and Z5 and Z6 too, is this right here, because I want to get low to the ground. I can just flip this thing up and I can see it perfectly. With the Zf, I have to open it, turn it around, flip it out, and then angle it. Yeah, it's an extra step, not a huge deal, and yes, I'm kind of splitting hairs here. But for me personally, the flippy screen is nice. I do like how they've made this textured surface in the background. That's pretty cool. So when you close the shot, it actually looks like an old film camera, going along with the whole retro stylistic appeal of the camera in the first place. But I'm just not a huge fan of the tilty flippy screen in general. It's fine, and I'm sure some folks will love it, but for me personally, I could do with or without it. So there you have it. Those are 5 things that I don't want to say hate, but 5 things that have kind of annoyed me about the Nikon Zf since I've had it now going on 7 weeks, which to me is a fair amount of time to make a reasonably good assessment of the camera's pros and cons, etc. But please stay tuned, because pretty soon I'm going to post 5 things that I love about this camera. I'm Darren Miles with Darren Miles Photography, and I'm based here in beautiful, sunny Southwest Florida. If you like videos like this, go ahead and give me a like, or better yet, subscribe. And until the next time, thank you so much for watching, and happy shooting.